synth leads. What's up, dogs? It's Cameron with Venus Theory, and today we're here to talk about creating lead sounds for stuff like wave and witch house and trap and kind of all forms of EDM, but more with that kind of retro futuristic approach. So this is a very highly requested thing that after looking back, I realized I've never really touched on, which is kind of dumb of me. So today we're going to get that video out of the way. So I decided I wanted to show you guys just several different sounds and kind of explain the approach to making these types of things, because it's not that difficult. It's just kind of a different way of going about it than you would with some of the heavier genres or more like super modern electronic sounding genres. So anyways, let's dive into Cubase and get started. All right, guys, so we're here and we're ready to get started to talk about wave leads and witch house leads, and I guess by extension future garage and vaporwave and pretty much any form of electronic music you can think of, because these are pretty general patches. And today we're going to be using Diva and we're going to be using Retrologue. And you might be asking why, why not use Serum or Massive or something? And to be honest, it's just because I'm way more comfortable with these analog style synths, as that's kind of what I grew up using. And honestly, a lot of the features of stuff like Serum aren't really necessary, because most of these sounds are made using just basic waveforms. So, this is really all I need, is something simple and straightforward, because a lot of what we're doing is just simple stuff with envelopes and filters and things of that nature. And, you can do this in Massive or Serum, so if that's what you have, feel free to follow along. So first up, to kick things off, I figured we would talk about the very super typical wave sound, which is using a square wave, and we're going to detune it a couple times. So if you're not familiar with Diva and waveforms and stuff, waveforms are just different shapes of oscillator noises that come out of the sound holes which hit your ear holes. And a square wave sounds like this. So it's very big and meaty, and it's not quite as aggressive sounding as a saw. It's just, a little thicker, basically. So the way to go about this is just using a couple of very simple things. First up, we're going to need to get some unison. So we can use the stack function in Diva in order to do this. So I'm going to stack 3 together. And then under the trimmers tab down here, I'm going to detune these. So we're going to detune one by like 0.6 and detune the other by like 0.4. And now we get this very big, weird detune thing. We can move this up an octave and we get this. Cool. Sounds like, pretty much the sound we're after here. So essentially what I'm creating here is just a Reese patch with squares and moving it up an octave, and that makes a lead. But it doesn't really sound that interesting or cool. So there's a couple things we can do. One of the things is using built-in processing in the synth. So we could use the plate reverb from Diva here, up the wet, make it really large. That's starting to get interesting. We could set this to note priority last. We could set this to time and up the glide, and we get kind of a nice glidey synth. And then, from here, we could just use a touch of EQ, and we could just cut out some of the low end that we really don't need, and maybe just kind of taper off the high end after about 7K or so. And, play some big spooky minor chords. So from here, there's a couple other things we could do. We could filter this, but then we could also use these envelopes to create this kind of lead without attack. We could up this even more for a more dramatic effect. We could get rid of the sustain and enable some release here. In a regular envelope, this is basically what it should look like. So we're getting rid of sustain, upping some release. Maybe move the decay down a bit, get something like this. That's not really quite doing what I want, so what we could do is something like this. We get a nice plucky one. We could open up the attack just a little bit. So you'll hear it's like almost there. So what I want to do is affect the cutoff of the filter with the other envelope. So we'll move this to analog mode, and what we could do is just up the attack and decay here a little bit. Or we could up the attack pretty far, get rid of the decay. We could get the attack back here and then have the filter open up over time. We could up the decay really far. Get rid of the attack on the filter. So there's a whole lot of things you could do here, and especially if you up the attack on both, you kind of get that nice soft pluck. So that's kind of one really classic patch that I hear a lot. So another variation on this, if I reset this, is to do something with saws. So we could use saws, we could do 2 oscillators and just detune them a little bit. So we got a respace, we could up them an octave. Then we could just do a low pass filter, 12 decibels per octave, and open up the envelope here. So this is going to affect the filter. This will create kind of a nice plucky sound. And then again, really we could maybe just do chorus and just built-in processing. Nothing too crazy. Chorus and a reverb. So this is a little harsh, and again, we could just do some general EQ work to kind of fix this, so it probably needs a cut right around 400 or so. A little bit less, so around 200. And this is just a very loud patch, so by turning this down, it should sound a bit better. So we could get rid of sustain again and just do a very low decay, open the release. And if we set our mode to mono, this will re-trigger every time. And a common theme you're gonna see here is that, a lot of what I'm going for is just very 80s style things. So one other thing I kind of wanted to talk about with creating these old school sounding leads, is not only just utilizing basic waveforms, but also using the, matrix and things like noise oscillators to your advantage. So what we could do here, we're going to create another patch that's very common, which is a triangle wave with a saw an octave above. It sounds like this. So nothing really too fancy, and then we could just do some detuning here. So we'll get multiple voices, so we'll do like 2 on each. If I can drag this up, detune these a little bit, should get something decent. And again, you'll hear it really doesn't sound that fancy, but it's just, this processing after the fact is what works. So we'll use a little bit of filter distortion. We could maybe do 12 decibel per octave low pass, add a bit of resonance on it. But, we're kind of missing that really weird analog feel. So we could just mix in a bit of white noise. Don't need much. And then what we could do is use our LFOs to do something cool. So we're using LFO 1 here, and I want this to target the oscillator 1 pitch. So this LFO, as it moves, will move the pitch. So at a very drastic amount, I'll go ahead and only use oscillator 1 here so you can hear that, which is absolutely insane. But by doing a very slight value, maybe 0.6, we kind of get this weird detune thing going on. If we up the frequency, maybe up the value a bit more. Low frequency, maybe not quite as drastic. And then we start mixing in the other oscillator. We get this nice kind of weird detuned lo-fi sounding lead. So from here we could toss this into a nice big reverb of some kind. And then before that we could probably cut out some of the low end with some EQ. Something about like so. And then just a nice gentle high shelf starting around here just to kind of soften up the highs. Could get rid of more low end. And if we play this in a nice high octave, you could up the highs and maybe cut out even more low end for a more drastic effect. And then you'll kind of get the idea, as you up the voices and up the detune, you kind of get a more dramatic sounding hive of bees effect. Or you could, you know, since we have all the low end cut out, you could go the opposite direction and play this in a very low octave. Or go even lower. Or alternate between the two because there are no rules. And then again from here, you know, it's just a matter of kind of messing about with some envelopes. So we could just up the attack here, kind of get rid of some of that. We could use this filter envelope here. We could do this to the cutoff, or you could use the envelope knob here. Either one would work, if you have Retrologue, that is. So this will open up the filter. We could have just a bit of an attack on it to get it a little more plucky, especially if we add the attack back here. You'll hear that that kind of makes the initial transient a bit more obvious. So that's another super common lead that I see. Another one I kind of wanted to talk about is the groaning acid sound. I heard this in the movie Bright on Netflix, which if you haven't seen, highly recommend. It's really good. There's a song in there called Crown by Camila Cabello. Don't know how to say her name, but anyways, this is another common one I've seen. This is a really easy effect. All it requires is a phaser. And Diva is really good at doing this because there's this flange mode in here, and I'll just kind of walk you through how this works. So what we could use, we'll use a square wave here, and we're just going to do the pulse mod. So pulse mod square means it's just a shorter square wave, basically. It makes it sound more like this. A little more groany and throaty. So what we could do the cutoff, 12 decibels per octave, nothing fancy, add a bit of emphasis, which is resonance. And you'll hear I'm kind of already getting that really throaty, growly sound. We can mix in a bit of noise and feedback, but once we enable this phaser, and we set the rate to be just above 0, and we'll set the depth to be 0, we get this really cool effect. So this is the sound right now. Probably get rid of that noise, don't need that much. So what we're going for is this really throaty metallic sound, so with just a bit of noise. That sounds much better, and we enable this phaser. By abusing the feedback and the center knob, we can get this really cool metallic thing. So it's a little much, so we could drop the feedback. And then we start moving the center. And by lowering the emphasis or resonance, that's really how you make that sound. And I hear that a lot now, especially as things kind of go more towards the trappy end of wave. This is a really popular sound that people seem to really utilize a lot. So then you could mix in maybe a saw like an octave higher. But not really necessary. You could sync the waveforms, which is what I would do. And then once you get into a higher octave, it has kind of a different character to it. So that's another really, really cool sound that I hear a lot of people using. Finally, just kind of one more sound I wanted to show you is the really gentle lead. Once I make this, you'll probably hear right away what I'm talking about. So what we could do is we're going to use 3 oscillators. You can use only 2. This third one is totally optional, so feel free to ignore this. And then we're going to blend these together. So right now I'm going to get rid of the third oscillator. Oscillator 1 is going to be a sine wave. Oscillator 2 is going to be a triangle. We're going to do some detuning here, so I'm going to set these to the multi-mode. We're going to up the first one to about 4 voices. Up the next one, this is up to you. You could do 2, you could do 5, you could do 16 if you want. It doesn't really matter. And by blending these together, you kind of get this cool organ thing going on almost. And then once you start detuning, it starts to get really interesting. And you know, it's a bit much. So usually I will use a high pass on this. So I could do high pass 12. And then just get rid of some of the attack. And then if we mix in this one, this is another sine oscillator, which is an octave up. this will kind of add that upper register to it. And then you could go another octave up and just blend this in pretty gently. Then we could maybe detune this final one a little bit. Add in a bit of noise. About like so. Then we could do the same thing. We're going to grab the LFO and we're going to have this affect the pitch of everyone by a value of like 0.6, 0.3, you know, something fairly gentle, very slow frequency. Or if you wanted, you could have affect only a certain oscillator, so we could do oscillator 2's pitch. Maybe add a bit of filter distortion and a touch of resonance. Start to get this weird detuned thing, but once you drown that out with like a gigantic reverb, it sounds really interesting. So we're going to drop the high cut and up the wet really far. Except this is getting very, very loud, so sorry about that. So anyways, you kind of get the idea. It makes this really weird kind of detuned, spooky skeleton thing going on. And if you have this in polyphonic mode and play some chords, we could drop the volume there and up the attack a little more, you get this really kind of interesting lead slash pad sound. So that's another one, probably the last one I'll show here because there are just so many different sounds, but I hope this kind of clarifies the process of how to go about making these sounds is, you know, stick with something simple and don't try to overthink it. Just try and force yourself to use something very basic, you know, start with some detuned saws, start messing with your envelopes and start routing those envelopes to do different things. So we could, you know, have this second envelope here, this could affect the resonance of the filter. And we could also tie it to the filter FM or whatever you want. And that's the thing is, you know, it's all very simple things. And then just EQ, reverb, delays, bit crushing, you know, just your general processing that you might do to other things. Try applying that to a very, very basic lead sound. And you would be very surprised with how far that will take you. And that's it for this video, guys. So thanks for watching. And I hope you learned something. As always, be sure to like and subscribe. And I will see you guys again soon.